I'm Michael Carter, 40 years old, a soldier, who came home carrying medals in a box and silence in my chest. But what I didn't know then was that the war waiting for me in Pine Hill would be harder than the one I left overseas. In my family, Daniel was always the favorite, the charming younger brother who never carried the weight but always received the praise. Mother believed every word he spoke. Uncle Robert stayed quiet, even when he saw the cracks. And me? I was the dutiful son who left, the forgotten one who returned to find his place already filled. I thought coming back meant being welcome. Instead, the first thing Daniel gave me wasn't an embrace, it was a sneer through the glass of my truck. Medals won't pay the bills. His words cut sharper than any shrapnel I brought home. Ever had someone reduce your entire life to a single insult? Hit like if you've ever had your hard work dismissed, and comment if you've ever been told you don't measure up. For me, everything began the moment I set foot back in Pine Hill on streets that called me a hero, while my own family saw only a burden. I kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting too often on that small wooden box on the passenger seat, as if touching it might quiet the storm inside me. Veterans Day banners stretched across Main Street like a series of reminders, red, white, and blue cloth hanging from lampposts, fluttering as though they were whispering my name. I hadn't been here in a decade, but the streets hadn't forgotten me. Posters with my face from years ago, a younger version in uniform, stared back from storefront windows. Welcome home, Michael Carter, Pine Hill's own. I almost laughed. They had no idea who I had become. They wanted a hero. What they'd get was a man who hadn't slept through a night without hearing the screams of sand and fire. I gripped the metal box again, so hard my knuckles whitened. Honor so easy to print on a poster, so impossible to carry in my chest. A couple walked by, pointing at me through the windshield. They nodded politely, almost shyly, the way people do when they think they're in the presence of someone greater than themselves. I nodded back, pretending not to see the quick shift in their eyes, the fascination, then the doubt, like they wondered if the medals were earned or just handed out. Pine Hill was small enough for stories to stick and rumors to rot. The closer I got to the square, the tighter my chest grew. Storefronts had changed hands, an old diner replaced by a craft brewery, a hardware store now a boutique, but the Carter name was still on the lips of passers-by. I caught fragments as I rolled past an open cafe door. He's back. Wonder if he's different. Daniel said he was always too stiff, too proud. My brother's voice traveled ahead of me, even before I saw him. I pulled into the curb near the town hall. The crowd was beginning to gather for rehearsals. The brass section of the school band stood outside, horns shining against the pale sun. My medals felt heavier with each note they played, muffled by distance but sharp enough to pierce. That's when I saw him. Daniel leaned casually against a lamppost, his coat collar flipped up, hands tucked deep into pockets like he owned the whole street. He'd aged, sure lines etched across his forehead, the kind that came from deals gone sour rather than battles fought, but his eyes still held that restless gleam, the kind that never forgave anyone else's success. He spotted me instantly. I slowed the truck, and his mouth curved into that same crooked grin I remembered from childhood, the one that always came before trouble. I didn't even have time to roll down the window before he pushed off the post, stepped close, and let his words cut through the glass. Medals won't pay the bills, brother. Simple, sharp, like a knife slipped between ribs. He didn't wait for my answer. He just smirked, patted the hood of my truck twice like he was blessing a casket, and walked away toward the square. I sat frozen, the steering wheel slick beneath my hands. The posters around me seemed to laugh in chorus with him, their colors suddenly garish, mocking. My throat tightened as if the whole town was leaning in, waiting to see whether I'd break or stand. The box of medals rattled against the seat when I shifted, each one a weight of memory, each one a debt unpaid. Uncle Robert's words from years ago slipped back into my mind, uninvited but steady. One day you'll have to remember that courage isn't about war, it's about what you face when you come home. He'd spoken about Mark Lewis that night, a name I hadn't heard since the desert, a comrade I'd half believed was gone forever. I pressed my palm against the box again, fighting the urge to slam the accelerator, to drive until Pine Hill was nothing but a memory in the rearview mirror. But he didn't. Instead, I stayed there long enough to hear the band strike up another tune, long enough to feel the eyes of strangers sliding across me like judgment. Michael clenches the steering wheel, unease rising. A family dinner can feel more like a battlefield than any desert war. The clink of silverware against porcelain carried the same tension as the rattle of bullets in a chamber, sharp and brittle. I hadn't sat at this long wooden table in over 10 years. Yet the chairs seemed unchanged, carved oak heavy with memory. Portraits of ancestors watched from the walls, their faces caught in oil paint, stern and expectant. Pine Hill might have dressed me up on its posters, but this room, the Carter dining room, was where the true battles were fought. The turkey on the platter smelled of rosemary and butter, the mashed potatoes steamed, and the rolls lay perfectly stacked in their basket. Mother had spared no effort to dress the table in abundance, but abundance didn't soften her gaze. Evelyn Carter's eyes cut sharper than any blade, pale blue and unyielding. She nodded to me once as I sat down, no words of welcome, only the stiff approval of a hostess, satisfied that her table was full. Daniel sat across from me, shoulders relaxed, fork already twirling through the beans as if he'd earned them. He had changed in little ways. His suit was new, his watch expensive, but the smug curl of his lip hadn't aged a day. Uncle Robert took his place at the far end, back straight, silent as the cross above the mantel. His presence was both shield and judge, and I wondered if he'd break his silence tonight, or let the family tear itself apart as he had so many times before. We ate in brittle quiet at first, the kind where each scrape of fork felt like thunder. Then Daniel leaned back, balancing his glass between his fingers, and spoke with that casual tone he used when he wanted to sting. "The land, Mike? That old property out by the ridge, it's wasted. We could sell it, split the money, actually put it to use." I felt my jaw tighten. The land wasn't just soil. It was where our father had walked the rows at dawn, where my grandfather had built the barn with his own hands. It was Carter history, every nail and furrow a memory carved into earth. I laid my fork down carefully, as if calm could shield me. "That land doesn't belong on an auction block. It belongs to the family." Daniel's grin spread, his teeth glinting under the chandelier light. "Family? You think the dead care about barns and fences? We could get $500,000 easy, maybe more. Mom could finally live like she deserves, and I wouldn't be drowning in debt keeping this place alive." Mother's fork clattered onto her plate. She looked not at Daniel, but at me, sharp as a gavel. "Your brother is right, Michael. The land has been nothing but a burden. You can't farm it, not with your condition. Better to sell and let it bring value." Her words struck like shrapnel. I wanted to tell her about the nights I dreamed of that land, the mornings overseas when I promised myself I'd come back and walk it again, whole and unbroken. Instead, I only glanced at Uncle Robert, silently begging for an ally. But he sat still, hands folded, lips pressed tight. His silence wasn't neutral, it was disapproval, wrapped in restraint. His gaze drifted briefly toward Daniel, then to me, and I read the truth in his eyes. He knew what Daniel wanted wasn't just money, it was victory. I pushed my plate back, appetite gone. The air in the room felt heavy, as if the portraits themselves were leaning in to listen. Daniel saw my hesitation and lunged at it like a predator. He laughed softly, then louder, until the sound filled the room like a drumbeat. "Metals can't farm land, Mike." The words hit harder than I expected. I saw sand swirling, heard the scream of mortar shells. The table blurred, replaced by desert heat, the roasted turkey smell drowned out by burning oil and cordite. My hand trembled around the stem of my glass, sweat slicking my palm, though the room was cool. Michael drifts into a battlefield memory. Some nights I still wake to the sound of mortars. Tonight, it's only the clink of a whiskey glass. The amber liquid caught the dim neon light of the bar sign, glowing like fire trapped in a bottle. The Veterans Bar in Pine Hill was the same as I remembered, a place where smoke never quite cleared, where laughter was edged with sorrow, and where every man who walked in carried his ghosts on his shoulders. I chose the far end of the counter, away from the pool table and the jukebox that hadn't worked right since the 80s. My medals lay heavy in the box beside me on the stool, though I kept a hand draped over them, as if someone might steal them even here, among supposed brothers in arms. The walls were yellowed by years of cigarettes, plastered with photos of young men who'd once looked fearless before shipping off to places they'd never fully leave. Around me, the aging vets told their same stories in new words, repeating battles with different details each time, as if retelling them might finally make the memories behave. One of them, Harold, a man with hands twisted by arthritis, leaned closer as the bartender filled his glass. "I remember your unit, Carter. The papers said you boys carried half the valley out on your backs. Pine Hill's pride, they called you." His eyes clouded, not with liquor but with something heavier. Shame most of them never came back. I nodded, unable to speak. The metals in the box seemed to hum, each ribbon like a tongue that could tell a story I had no strength to voice. I pulled the box closer, cracked it open just an inch. Bronze, silver, dull gold, they glowed in the bar's dim light. Not as rewards, but as reminders, I whispered, so quietly even the bartender polishing glasses a few feet away couldn't hear me. This isn't mine alone. The words trembled out, meant not for the living, but for those buried in sand half a world away. The jukebox sputtered suddenly, then spat out a tinny tune before dying again, the sound startling me more than I cared to admit. I rubbed my temples, fighting the memories that pressed in with each sip of whiskey. In the corner, two men argued about politics, their voices rising, then falling into laughter that felt like knives on my skin. That's when Joe, a former Marine with a limp that dragged like a chain, slid onto the stool beside me. His eyes studied the box at my elbow, then studied me. "Word is Daniel's been talking a lot around town," he muttered, his voice carrying the weight of unwanted truth. "Telling folks your medals are for show, that you don't deserve half the respect Pine Hill's throwing at you." The whiskey turned sour in my mouth. I swallowed hard, setting the glass down too roughly. The liquid sloshed over the rim, dripping down the counter like spilled blood. He doesn't know what he's saying. I managed, though my voice cracked. Joe shrugged, not cruel, just resigned. Maybe, but words in a town this small spread faster than fire in dry grass. "Be careful, Mike. He's aiming to light you up." The bar's smoke thickened, or maybe it was just my vision blurring. I clenched the metal box tighter, as if the wood could hold back the tide Daniel had loosed. My breath grew shallow, chest tight, as the weight of whispers settled over me heavier than any mortar shell. Michael's unease sharpens. When she walked into the room, I forgot for a moment how heavy silence could be. The newsroom wasn't busy. Not anymore. The place smelled faintly of ink and dust, the printers sitting idle, their edges crusted with years of overuse. Old black and white photographs lined the walls, capturing parades from decades past, veterans standing straighter than their bones allowed, flags bright against faded skies. Veterans Day had always been Pine Hill's pride, and now my face was plastered across this office like a headline waiting to be rewritten. I'd come looking for the schedule, some scrap of detail about the ceremony so I could brace myself for what was coming. I didn't expect her. Sarah Mitchell, she still carried herself the way she had in high school. Quick stride, chin up, eyes that seemed to read more than words. She was older, of course, but the years had added gravity rather than wear. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, darker now, and she wore a blazer over a plain blouse, simple but sharp. Our eyes caught, and for a beat, the years between us vanished. She smiled, though not the easy smile I remembered. It was hesitant, careful, as if she wasn't sure which version of me had walked back into town. "Michael," she said softly, my name catching the dust in the air. "You're really back." I nodded, shifting the box of medals under my arm like a shield. I needed to see how Pine Hill looked after 10 years. Turns out it looks a lot like the past. She gestured toward the photographs on the wall, her expression somewhere between pride and apology. "We've been preparing for the ceremony for weeks. The town's excited. They want a hero to celebrate." I almost laughed, but the sound stuck in my throat. "Heroes don't come home, Sarah. They stay buried where the sand never cools." Her eyes flickered, sympathy mingling with something sharper. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Daniel's been talking, more than usual. He tells anyone who'll listen that you're overrated, that the medals are just decoration." The words hit like shrapnel, even though I'd already suspected. My grip on the box tightened. Of course he has. He's always needed a stage, even if it means burning down his own family. For a moment we stood there, two people orbiting the same wound. She looked at me the way she used to, searching for the boy she'd once known, and finding instead a man layered with scars. The silence thickened until she cut it with a question that landed harder than she intended. "Do you regret coming back, Michael?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. My gaze drifted to the window, to the fluttering banner outside where my name hung in block letters, and I let the silence say everything I couldn't. Michael looks away, unable to answer. The brass instruments gleamed under the hall lights, like a warning before a storm. Their polished curves reflected the chandeliers above, scattering little fragments of gold across the wooden floor. The Pine Hill Community Hall was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Rows of folding chairs stretched from the stage to the back wall, filled with faces I half remembered and others I didn't recognize at all. Some people smiled when they caught my eye, but most just studied me as if weighing whether I deserved to stand where they had placed me. I moved slowly down the aisle, each step heavy, my boots echoing against the varnished floor. The box of medals pressed against my side beneath my arm, and I swore I could hear them rattling like bones. Whispers rippled through the crowd as I passed. 1,000 tiny verdicts carried on hushed breath. Above it all, the band tuned their horns, the notes sharp, then mellow, then sharp again like a blade being tested before use. Mother sat near the front in her best blue dress, her silver hair pinned back neatly. She gave me a glance that was quick and unreadable, her lips pressed so tight they were nearly colorless. Daniel was beside her, of course, lounging as if the seat were a throne, one arm sprawled across the back of the chair. When I walked by, he leaned forward slightly, close enough for only me to hear. "Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts," he muttered, his breath sour with something stronger than coffee. "It doesn't shine long on liars." I kept walking, jaw locked, though every muscle in me screamed to answer. Sarah was standing by the press table near the side, a camera slung over her shoulder. Her eyes caught mine, steady but troubled, like she was watching a man walk into a storm she couldn't stop. The master of ceremonies, a broad man with a practiced smile, tapped the microphone until the hall fell into silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed, "thank you for joining us as we honor Pine Hill's own, Sergeant Michael Carter." Applause rose, scattered but sufficient. My throat tightened. I didn't want the applause. I wanted the silence of the desert, the voices of the men who couldn't be here. Still, I carried myself toward the stage, step by step, as though walking into fire again. Daniel leaned back in his seat, watching me climb. His smirk widened with every rung of the short stairway, eyes gleaming in the bright lights. He folded his hands together like a man about to watch a show he'd scripted himself. The master of ceremonies gestured toward me, smile fixed. "Sergeant Carter, would you do us the honor of speaking?" I reached the podium. The wooden surface was smooth beneath my palms, polished from years of community speeches, graduations, debates, and promises. The band fell still, instruments lowered, as though sensing something unscripted was about to unfold. The weight of every eye in the hall pressed down, hot and suffocating. And there was Daniel, smirking, lips curled with the certainty that his moment had arrived. He was ready to strike, ready to turn the crowd against me before I could even open my mouth. Michael steps up as the hall waits. Daniel's laugh echoed louder than the brass band itself. It rang through the hall, bouncing off the rafters, raw and deliberate, pulling every head away from me and toward him. I had been standing at the podium for only a breath, hands gripping its polished edge, when he decided the moment belonged to him. The microphone hadn't yet touched my lips. The silence, thick with expectation, cracked under the force of his laughter. I felt the crowd's eyes shift, hundreds of them, some startled, others already amused. Daniel rose slowly from his chair near the front, the smirk on his face twisting into something crueler with each step he took toward the stage. My mother Evelyn gave a small gasp, clutching her purse tighter against her lap, but she didn't call him back. She never did. Sarah, standing near the press table, raised her camera instinctively, though the lens trembled, as if even she wasn't sure she should be recording this. "Look at him," Daniel said, loud enough for the microphone to catch his words, though it hadn't been offered to him. "Our big hero, back from the desert with a chest full of shiny trinkets." He leaned in, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Tell us, Mike, did you polish them before you came here? Or do they shine like that on their own?" A ripple of chuckles moved through the hall, thin at first, then louder as people surrendered to the awkwardness. Laughter in Pine Hill spread like infection, nervous, unsure, but still contagious. I could see the discomfort in their eyes even as they smiled, as if they didn't want to offend me but couldn't resist being swept along by Daniel's bravado. My throat tightened, the words I'd prepared turning to ash. I thought of Joe's warning in the bar, the whispers Daniel had been planting, the seeds of doubt watered with malice. Now they were blooming in front of me, and everyone had come to watch. "Cheap metal," Daniel continued, his voice rising. He gestured broadly at the box I'd placed on the podium. "That's all it is. Cheap metal passed around to anyone who can survive long enough to collect it. Doesn't mean a damn thing." The nervous chuckles turned into something sharper, a handful of outright laughs echoing from the back rows. I caught Sarah's eyes again, wide, conflicted, the camera half raised as if capturing this would make her complicit. Evelyn lowered her gaze to her lap, her silence a knife twisting in my chest. I wanted to speak, to remind them of the names etched on marble walls overseas, of the bodies lowered under flags they would never see. But my mouth wouldn't open. The words lodged behind my teeth, too heavy to force out. Daniel stepped closer, close enough now that I could see the sweat at his hairline, the wild gleam in his eyes. He leaned toward me, and though the microphone wasn't in front of him, his voice carried clearly across the hushed hall. Your medals can't hide your failures. It was the cut he'd been saving, sharper than the rest, and it landed with precision. The hall grew quieter still, the kind of silence that comes after a blow, when everyone waits to see if blood will follow. My chest burned, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I let my gaze drift past him, away from his sneer, to the band assembled on the far side of the stage. Their instruments glinted under the lights, brass and wood and silver, waiting like soldiers at rest. Michael looks to the band. I didn't need a microphone. I had music. The words never left my mouth, but they pulsed through me as I lifted my hand, a small gesture, sharp enough for the band to catch. The conductor hesitated for half a heartbeat, eyes darting from me to the restless crowd, then to Daniel standing smugly by my side. But the look I gave him must have been enough. It wasn't a request. It was an order, the kind only soldiers and men who'd carried the weight of silence knew how to give. The first notes rose slowly, brass low and steady, a rumble that shook the quiet air like distant thunder. The chatter in the hall died instantly. The mockery, the uneasy laughter, all of it drained out until only the music remained. Trumpets joined, solemn and sharp, then the drums rolled in like the memory of boots marching across foreign ground. I straightened, not speaking, not needing to. The anthem of my unit filled every inch of that hall. At first the audience didn't understand. They shifted in their chairs, confused, glancing at one another. Daniel's smirk faltered, then froze as the melody swelled, a song carried from blood-soaked valleys and blistering heat, now echoing against polished wood and chandeliers. Slowly, one man in the second row stood, hand pressed firm over his heart. Another followed, then another. Veterans, older than me, scarred deeper than me. Each one rose to their feet with deliberate reverence. Their silence was louder than any cheer Pine Hill could muster. I felt the air change. Even those who had laughed moments ago fell quiet, eyes fixed not on Daniel but on the men standing proud and saluting. The anthem bound them together, those who lived, those who died, those who carried memory like a wound that never closed. My chest tightened, but I let it. For once, I didn't resist the weight. I opened the box and placed it on the podium. The medals glinted under the stage lights, no longer just mine but reflections of every man who hadn't walked off the plane. My voice cut through the anthem's final bars, steady and low but carrying across the room with the clarity of confession. These medals are not mine alone, they belong to those who never came home. The last note lingered, trembling in the air before dissolving into silence. No one laughed now. The room stood still, charged, as though even the walls had been forced to bear witness. For a breath, it felt like the dead themselves were present, their names unspoken yet felt by everyone who dared look at me. From the corner of my eye, I saw Sarah lift her camera, lens fixed on me, hands steady. The red light blinked as she recorded, capturing every flicker of the crowd's shifting gaze, every crease of fury on Daniel's face. His jaw tightened, his eyes burned with a rage that no anthem could smother. Sarah films it. Daniel's eyes burn with fury. Not every battle ends when the last note fades. The anthem still echoed faintly in my chest, its reverberations clinging to me like smoke after a fire, but the silence outside the hall had a different weight. The crowd had already begun to disperse, murmurs lingering in the air, half reverent, half unsettled. I slipped out through the side door into the cool November night, hoping the chill would steady me. The alley behind the community hall was dim, lit only by the glow of a street lamp that flickered as though it might give out at any moment. The air smelled of damp brick and fallen leaves. I let out a breath, pressing the metal box close, ready to be alone with the quiet. But I wasn't. Daniel was waiting, leaning against the wall as if he had been there all along, cigarette smoke curling around his face. He ground the butt under his shoe when I appeared, the ember dying in an instant. "Hell of a show, Mike," he said smoothly, his tone an imitation of warmth. "You really had them on their feet. Almost had me believing you, too." I didn't answer. My silence never deterred him. It only fueled him. He stepped closer, his shoes crunching against gravel. "Look, I know we've had our differences, but we're brothers. We should stick together, especially now." His hand slid into his coat pocket, fingers pulling out a folded sheet of paper. He held it like an offering, but the gleam in his eyes was anything but generous. I took the page cautiously, already sensing the trap. The paper was stiff, official, stamped with a bank's insignia. My name was printed across the top, followed by numbers that twisted my stomach into knots, figures I had never seen, debts I had never signed for. "You recognize that, don't you?" Daniel asked, tilting his head, voice still coated with false sympathy. "The bank's been patient, but patience runs out. You owe them, Mike, and when they come calling, they won't just take from you, they'll take from Mom, too. From all of us." The street lamp flickered again, shadows cutting harsh across his face. Behind him, the back door opened briefly, and our mother stepped out, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Evelyn's eyes darted between us, narrowing on the paper in my hands. "What is that?" she asked, her voice sharp, suspicious. Daniel's expression softened instantly, the practiced face of a dutiful son. "It's something Michael's been hiding, Mom. A debt. He never told you, but it's real. I didn't want you to find out this way, but better now than when the bank takes the land." I opened my mouth, but no words came fast enough. Evelyn's face hardened, disappointment flashing like lightning. The anthem, the respect I had clawed back moments ago, already felt as if it were slipping away. Daniel leaned in, his whisper slicing the night like a knife meant only for me. "Sell the land, or the bank will take it and blame you." I stared down at the page again, my heart pounding in my ears. The signature scrawled at the bottom mocked me, my own name, forged in ink, shaky but damning, as if the paper itself had already decided my guilt. Michael stares at the forged signature. Just when I thought the world had turned its back, a voice from the past called my name. The words cut through the haze of cigarette smoke and the low rumble of laughter in the veteran's bar, pulling me up from the bottom of my glass. I blinked at the amber liquid, half certain the sound belonged to memory, not flesh. But then I heard it again, steadier, unmistakable. "Mike Carter," the voice said, rough but familiar. I turned, and there he was, Mark Lewis. Shoulders still broad despite the years, hair grayer at the temples but eyes just as sharp as they'd been in the desert. For a moment, the bar fell away. I was back under the burning sun, sand sticking to sweat, his voice barking orders through the chaos of mortars and gunfire. My throat tight. I hadn't expected to ever see him again. "Mark," I managed, my voice hoarse. I stood, and we clasped hands, the grip iron, strong, the kind forged only where survival had been shared. He looked me over like a medic checking wounds, not for blood, but for what time and silence had done. "You've aged like the rest of us," he said with a tired smile. But I'd know that stubborn look anywhere. I motioned to the stool beside me, and he sat. The bartender poured him a whiskey without asking, sliding it across the scarred wood. Mark raised his glass, clinked it against mine. "To the ones who didn't come back," he said quietly. The words hollowed the room for me. We drank, and the silence afterward felt heavier than any toast. I reached into my coat pocket, brushing my fingers against the cold edges of the metal box. "These aren't mine alone," I whispered, almost without meaning to. Mark caught it. His gaze lingered on me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "Still carrying that weight, huh?" he asked. "I told myself you would. You were always the one who took more than your share." I gave a hollow laugh. "That weight is all I have left to show." He leaned closer, his tone shifting, words sharper now. "Number. It's not all you have. I saw you out there, Mike. I saw you carrying 3 men through fire while the world was collapsing around us. Don't you dare think those medals are meaningless. I'll stand with you." The conviction in his voice nearly undid me. For so long, the chorus of my life since the war had been Daniel's sneers, my mother's doubt, the town's whispers. But here was Mark, cutting through it all like a flare in the night, reminding me I hadn't imagined my own courage. He reached down to the duffel at his feet, something he'd kept close, even while ordering the drink. With deliberate care, he unzipped it and pulled out a folded piece of cloth, edges singed, colors faded but unmistakable. My breath caught. It was the unit flag, the one we thought had been lost in the firestorm of that final battle. The emblem was charred, threads frayed, but it lived, scarred like us. Mark spread it across the bar slowly, reverently. The veterans nearby fell silent, eyes widening at the sight. For a long moment, no one spoke. The flag itself seemed to breathe, carrying echoes of voices gone. My fingers trembled as I reached to touch the fabric, feeling the coarse burn marks under my skin. The room's smoke thickened, or maybe it was just my vision blurring. I looked at Mark, trying to form words. He only nodded, as though everything I couldn't say was already understood. Then, with the quiet authority of someone who had borne witness, he said, "This belongs with you now, and when the time comes, it'll speak louder than Daniel ever could." He reveals the burned unit flag. The charred flag smelled of smoke, and suddenly I was back in the fire. The storm outside rattled the windows of the rented room, rain hammering the glass like machine gun bursts, and the air seemed to thicken with heat and dust that weren't really there. I held the relic in my hands, the fabric rough beneath my fingers, edges curled and blackened by flame. The faint odor of ash clung to it, as if time had failed to wash the battlefield away. Mark sat across from me, silent. He didn't need to speak. He knew where the flag had carried me. His eyes held the kind of patience only a soldier could have. He let the silence do its work, let the memories come. My chest tightened, and before I could stop it, the years dissolved, and I was back in the sandstorm of war. I heard the roar first, the mortars, the screams, the desperate calls that were never answered. The night had glowed red and orange, fire twisting upward as if the sky itself were tearing apart. I saw men falling, men I knew by name, by laugh, by the way they had written letters home they never mailed. I saw the weight of their bodies across my shoulders as I carried them through fire, flesh burning, lungs choking. And I heard their voices, ghostly and distant, calling my name even now. I clutched the flag tighter, as though it might tether me to the present. My knees buckled under the weight of the memory. Mark reached out, steadying me, but didn't take the flag. He knew it wasn't his to hold anymore. "They died for this," I whispered, my voice breaking. "And I left with nothing but this box." I gestured weakly at the medals on the table, gleaming in the dull yellow lamplight. "And Daniel, he laughs at it. He spits on them. On me." Mark's jaw clenched. He leaned forward, his voice low and certain. "Then don't let him. Don't you dare let him erase what they died for. That flag is proof, living proof of what happened. And you, your scars, your medals, they're not shame, Mike. They're testimony." The storm cracked outside, thunder shaking the walls. I bent over the flag, pressing my forehead to it, and the tears came, raw and uncontrollable. For years I had held myself together with steel and silence, convinced there was no room for grief. But here, with Mark, with the storm outside echoing the one inside me, I finally let it go. The sobs tore from me like shrapnel, jagged and unrelenting. But when the storm inside began to ebb, a strange calm filled its place. I looked up, my hands trembling as I smoothed the battered fabric. "I can't let him erase what they died for," I said, every syllable ringing like an oath. My voice cracked, but the vow held. The room went quiet. Mark gave a solemn nod, the kind that sealed a pact without need of paper or ink. The storm outside eased for a moment, wind whistling against the eaves, as though the night itself bore witness. Then the phone rang. The sound jolted me, harsh and insistent, dragging me back into the world of the living. I snatched it up, still shaking. "Michael?" Sarah's voice rushed through the line, urgent, breathless. "It's Daniel. He's already moving. He just pushed a story to the press. He's telling everyone you forged your own debt, that you're drowning in shame and trying to cover it with medals. You need to see this." The screen of my phone lit up with a headline already spreading across the local news feed. Daniel's fingerprints all over it. My hand froze around the device, heart slamming. Sarah calls. Daniel pushes fake story to media. The next morning, my face was on the front page not as a hero, but a fraud. The newspaper print bled into my vision as if the ink itself had been poisoned. Words leapt out at me, twisted headlines screaming that I was drowning in debt, that I had faked my honor, that I had returned not as a soldier of merit, but as a con man hiding behind ribbons and brass. The cafe smelled of burnt coffee and buttered toast, but all I could taste was ash. Around me, whispers buzzed like mosquitoes. Every booth seemed to have a copy of the paper spread wide, photos of me in uniform plastered alongside Daniel's carefully crafted accusations. The rustle of pages turned into the sound of chains, tightening, dragging me down. Heads tilted my way, and eyes that once nodded with respect now narrowed, suspicious, doubtful. At the counter, Sarah held her own copy, her knuckles white around the edge of the newsprint. She looked up at me, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Her eyes, bright and steady the night before, flickered now with conflict. I dropped into the chair across from her. The newspaper slapped the table between us, my picture staring back at me. "He wasted no time," I muttered, trying to steady my breath. Daniel always knew where to strike hardest out in the open, where the town could do his work for him. She reached across the table, hesitant, her fingers brushing mine before retreating. Michael, it's not just gossip. He gave them documents, papers that look official. Bank notices, signatures, people believe it. I stiffened, the forged debt notice still vivid in my memory. He forged those papers, Sarah, you know that. He cornered me after the ceremony and shoved them in my face. My voice cracked, low but sharp. But now he's dressed it up, handed it to the press, and they swallowed it whole. From the far side of the cafe, a chair scraped the floor. Daniel Carter strolled in, casual as ever, like he owned the air itself. The townsfolk greeted him with nods, even smiles. Their faith already shifted his way. He ordered a coffee, loud enough for all to hear, then turned toward me, the grin spreading across his face. You always did like being in the papers, Mike, he said as he sauntered over, voice carrying. Just a shame it's for all the wrong reasons this time. The cafe chuckled nervously. Sarah froze, her gaze darting between us. I clenched my jaw, every muscle begging me to stand, to throw the truth at his smirking face. But Daniel leaned in, lowering his voice just enough so only Sarah and I could hear. Lies catch up with you, Mike. His words dripped with venom. But to the listening crowd, it was theater, another Carter family drama for their morning entertainment. He sipped his coffee, savoring the silence that followed, letting the paper do the rest of his talking. I turned back to Sarah, desperate. You don't believe him, do you? My voice cracked, too raw, betraying the fear that clawed at me. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes searched mine, torn between what she knew of me and the mountain of ink and paper stacked against me. Her silence stretched, heavier than accusation, heavier than pity. Michael questions if Sarah trusts him. When the world turned its back, a hand from the battlefield lifted me. I had been sitting alone at the edge of the Veterans Hall, the smell of coffee and old wood filling the air, when Mark placed his hand on my shoulder. His grip was steady, firm, the kind of anchor only someone who had faced the same fire could give. My chest still ached from the poison Daniel had poured into the town, but Mark's presence steadied the shaking ground beneath me. The hall was full that night. The chairs scraped as veterans filed in, men and women whose faces bore the lines of sacrifice. They wore their scars in silence, and yet their silence held weight, heavier than Daniel's noisy accusations. Some glanced my way, their expressions uncertain. I could feel their doubt, fed by the papers curdling in the corners of the room. Mark stood up first. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need it. His voice carried across the hall, roughened by years of smoke and sand, but clear as steel. You've heard the stories in the paper, he began, his gaze sweeping the crowd. But I was there. I saw Michael Carter carry 3 men through fire when most of us thought none of us would see another sunrise. The murmurs quieted. A few veterans leaned forward, eyes narrowing, recognizing the name, the day, the battle. Mark reached into his bag and drew out the relic, the charred unit flag. He held it high, the torn fabric sagging, burned edges whispering of the past. Gasps rippled through the room. The sight of it carried the room back to that battlefield, Pine Hill's distant sons brought to life again in one blackened scrap of cloth. He's no fraud, Mark continued, his voice rising, sharp with memory. He carried us through hell. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't ask for medals. He asked only that we live, and many of us stand here tonight because he did. I felt my throat close. The room seemed to tilt as men I hadn't seen in years stood one by one adding their voices. An old sergeant with a cane gripped the back of a chair and said, I saw him pull Johnson out of the fire, saw it with my own eyes. Another leaned on the wall, his hands trembling, but his voice steady. I would have been buried overseas if not for him. That's truth. The air shifted. The doubt that had hung like smoke began to thin, replaced with something else. Recognition, memory, respect. Even the townsfolk who had crept in, clutching folded papers, now stared with wide eyes. Some lowered the newspapers quietly into their laps. Sarah was in the corner, notebook forgotten. Phone in hand but not recording. She stared at Mark, at me, at the flag, her breath caught in her chest. Her eyes weren't just reporting anymore, they were searching. I could see it in her face. She was deciding. She had heard Daniel's story. She had seen the town sway with it. But here in this hall, with Mark's words and the veterans' voices, another truth was carving its way forward. The hall fell quiet again, heavy with the weight of testimony. Mark lowered the flag slowly, his arm trembling but unbroken. The world may choose to believe lies, he said, softer now, but those of us who walk through the fire know the truth. And the truth is, Michael Carter is no fraud. He is the reason many of us breathe tonight. The veterans rose to their feet, not with applause, but with the solemnity of soldiers who had carried each other across graves. Their silence was the loudest sound I had ever heard. In that silence I caught Sarah's gaze. Her jaw tightened, her hand gripping her pen until it bent. She didn't look away. She didn't write. Instead, I saw the decision form in her eyes, a determination that no printed lie could shake. Sarah decides to dig deeper into Daniel. If Daniel forged my downfall, maybe his own lies had paperwork too. The thought haunted me through the restless night. The echo of Mark's words in the veterans' hall, unable to drown out the image of Daniel's smirk. The way he had waved that debt notice in my face as though it were scripture. If he had faked my ruin, then surely somewhere, in the dusty corners of Pine Hill's records, his fingerprints would betray him. Sarah insisted we go together. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of my rented room as she stood in the doorway, notebook tucked under her arm but unused, her eyes sharp with determination. If the papers are real, we'll know. And if they're not, we'll have proof, she said. I couldn't argue. For the first time since returning, I saw in her not just a reporter, but an ally willing to gamble her name beside mine. The town hall smelled of old paper and varnish, the kind of place where secrets weren't erased but buried under years of neglect. The clerk, a balding man with spectacles sliding down his nose, barely looked up when Sarah explained what we needed. Property deeds, mortgages, anything with the Carter name, she said briskly. Her voice carried the authority of someone who knew how to pry answers from stone. We sat at a long oak table while the clerk shuffled through files. My stomach tightened with every stack he placed before us. The documents felt heavier than they should have, as if they carried the weight of every betrayal I hadn't seen coming. Sarah spread the papers out carefully, her eyes darting across the pages, scanning signatures and dates with a practiced rhythm. Here, she muttered after a while, pointing to one set of documents, my name scrawled across the bottom of a mortgage agreement, but the letters were wrong, angled differently, the slant unnatural. She compared it with my discharge papers, with other forms I had signed before leaving for the service. It doesn't match. This isn't your hand, Michael. Daniel forged this. My chest tightened. Rage and relief warred inside me. For weeks he had painted me as reckless, careless with money and honor alike, and all the while, he had been signing my name like it was nothing more than ink on a page. Sarah didn't stop there. She dug deeper, flipping through more records, the pile growing, her brow furrowed. And then she froze. Oh, God. Her fingers traced another document, this one bearing Daniel's signature. It wasn't a forged one. It was real. A mortgage, signed by him, putting up the Carter family land as collateral. Not just any loan, one tied to a private lender known for snapping up foreclosed properties. The betrayal deepened with every line my eyes followed. It hadn't been enough for him to smear me. He had mortgaged the very soil we grew up on, gambling away the farm under the guise of saving it. He wasn't protecting our legacy, he was selling it piece by piece, while blaming me for the ruin. Sarah slammed her palm against the table, her eyes blazing. He's been setting you up from the start. Every headline, every rumor, it's all been part of this. He wanted you discredited so no one would question him when the land disappeared. The clerk cleared his throat nervously, glancing over his shoulder before leaning in. His voice was hushed, as though the walls themselves might carry news back to Daniel. You two didn't hear it from me, he whispered, but Daniel's been pushing hard to close the sale. He's scheduled to meet the buyers soon. Once the ink dries, it won't matter what you find in these files. The room tilted for a moment, the betrayal so sharp it felt physical. Sarah gathered the papers, her jaw tight. I stared at the mismatched signatures, the weight of my brother's schemes pressing down harder than any battlefield fire I had ever faced. Clerk warns Daniel plans to finalize sale soon. The ancestral house no longer feels like home. It feels like a courtroom. The dining room, where birthdays and Christmases once played out now, carried a different air, chilly, brittle, charged with the kind of tension that made every tick of the grandfather clock sound like a gavel. The portraits of long-dead Carters stared down from the walls, as though waiting for judgment themselves. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his posture bold, his eyes darting with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. A neat stack of papers lay in front of him, the contract arranged like a weapon. Evelyn sat beside him, hands clasped too tightly in her lap, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. Uncle Robert stood off to the side near the fireplace, silent but rigid, his jaw tight. Sarah lingered just behind me, notebook in one hand, the other resting against a slim folder that carried the truth like a blade hidden under cloth. "Let's stop circling around this," Daniel said, his voice sharp. He tapped the papers with a manicured finger. "This contract ensures stability for the family. The land is too much for us to maintain. Selling is the only logical step." I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice not to betray the storm beneath my skin. Instead, I let the silence hang, the kind that stretched across years of resentment, of words left unsaid. Evelyn swallowed. "Michael, Daniel says the debt is overwhelming. The bank," she faltered when her eyes met mine, and for a flicker, I saw the doubt beginning to gnaw at her certainty. Daniel leaned forward, pressing harder. "Mother, don't let sentiment blind you. He came back with nothing but stories and trinkets. Meanwhile, I've carried this farm. I've kept things afloat. Without this sale, we'll lose everything." Uncle Robert shifted, his eyes narrowing, but still he didn't speak. His silence was its own verdict, though Daniel ignored it. I kept my hands folded on the table, waiting. Let him spin his web. Let him believe he had cornered us. Finally, with a smirk, Daniel slid the contract toward Evelyn. "All you need to do is sign, and this burden disappears. Don't let his stubborn pride drag us all down." The weight of the moment pressed against me, but I didn't flinch. Sarah stepped forward. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, but it cut through Daniel's performance like glass shattering. "Before you sign anything, there's something you should see." All eyes turned to her as she opened the folder and laid out the documents. Her fingers moved with precision, placing the forged mortgage side by side with my genuine signatures. "Look at the slant, the spacing. This one," she tapped the forged line, "isn't Michael's hand. It's Daniel's trick. He forged this debt to make it look like Michael had ruined the family finances." The silence that followed was heavy. Evelyn's face drained of color as she leaned forward, squinting at the papers. Her hands trembled as she lifted one sheet and then another, comparing the signatures, her lips parting as realizations settled in. "Daniel, this isn't Michael's writing." Daniel's chair scraped loudly as he rose, his face flushed. "She's twisting things. She's a reporter. She'll say anything for a story." Sarah didn't flinch. She looked directly at Evelyn, her voice firm. "I don't need to say anything. The papers speak for themselves." He mortgaged the land under his own name, then framed Michael to hide it. The room erupted into a storm of unspoken truths. Uncle Robert finally broke his silence, his voice gravelly with restrained fury. "I told myself I'd stay out of it. But Daniel, I warned you once before lies rot everything they touch. And you've been lying to this family." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She looked from me to Daniel, her heart clearly breaking between her sons. But in the tremor of her voice, I heard the shift. "Daniel, what have you done?" Daniel's lips curled, the polished veneer slipping away to reveal the venom beneath. His words snapped through the room like a whip. "This isn't over. Tomorrow the whole town will see the truth." Sarah's papers rustled in the stillness that followed, but no one else spoke. The house felt heavier than ever, as though the walls themselves knew the family legacy was teetering on the edge of collapse. Daniel snarls, "This isn't over. Tomorrow the whole town will see the truth." This time, I let both the music and the truth speak. The year-end gathering at Pine Hills Town Hall had always been more celebration than ceremony, a place where neighbors shook hands, laughed over shared stories, and left the year's bitterness outside. But tonight the air hummed with unease, as if the crowd already knew a reckoning waited beneath the speeches and the music. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, banners draped the walls, and the brass instruments gleamed again under the hall's light symbols of pride and of what had once been mocked. Daniel stood near the front, his smile too sharp, his posture radiating the false confidence of a man who thought charm and volume could bury the truth. He clutched a folded newspaper, ready to wave it as proof of his lies. His voice carried early, louder than the chatter of townsfolk. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you all applaud, let me remind you our so-called hero has been living off illusions. Medals don't mend debts. Medals don't fix families. And tonight, we all deserve honesty." Whispers rippled through the hall. Some eyes fell on me with doubt, others with pity. My hand tightened around the charred flag Mark had entrusted to me. The relic smelled faintly of smoke even now, a reminder of nights lit by fire and loss. My heart thundered not with fear, but with the weight of what had to be said. Sarah stepped forward before I could speak, her folder pressed to her chest. Honesty, Daniel? Then let's be honest. She opened the papers with deliberate care, laying them across the podium for all to see. These contracts prove Daniel mortgaged the family land in secret. He forged his brother's name to frame him. Every debt, every claim, every accusation manufactured. The murmurs surged into gasps, and several townsfolk leaned closer, straining to glimpse the signatures. Daniel barked a laugh, brittle, desperate. Fabrications! A reporter's spin! But his face betrayed him, the twitch at his jaw, the sudden gleam of sweat under the lights. Mark rose from his seat, his voice steady but resonant, carrying the gravity of the battlefield into the hall. He lifted the burned flag high, the edges frayed, the center still bearing the insignia of our unit. I fought beside this man, he declared, his eyes sweeping the room. I saw him carry brothers through fire when most of us would have fallen. These medals, he gestured toward me, are not trinkets. They are blood and courage forged in hell. If you doubt him, doubt me, and doubt every soldier who stood in that sand. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, a pause where judgment balanced on a knife's edge. Then the band leader lifted his baton. At first I thought it was a mistake, but then the first notes of our unit's anthem rang out, clear and steady. One by one, veterans in the crowd rose to their feet, saluting with hands that shook from age but not from conviction. The music filled the hall, swelling against the rafters, erasing Daniel's words more completely than any argument could. I let the anthem carry me, let it fill the cracks his betrayal had carved. My voice found strength not in defense but in truth. These medals aren't mine alone, I said, my eyes sweeping across the rows of faces. They belong to the ones who never came home, the ones who gave everything so we could stand here and argue about land, about pride, about names in a ledger. No smear can erase them. No forgery can steal that. Applause broke like a storm, rolling through the hall in waves. Some townsfolk stood, clapping, with tears streaking their cheeks. Others turned their backs on Daniel, shaking their heads, murmuring about shame and betrayal. Evelyn, sitting in the front row, covered her mouth with trembling fingers, her eyes shining with something caught between sorrow and relief. Uncle Robert bowed his head, as if thanking the music for doing what words alone never could. Daniel's mouth opened and closed, searching for a defense, but the hall was no longer listening. Where once his voice had filled the room, now it was drowned in the anthem and the rising voices of a town reclaiming its dignity. His smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man who had run out of lies. Step by step, the people edged away from him, leaving him standing alone in a sea of rejection. The last note hung in the air, vibrating against the rafters before fading into silence. In that silence, Daniel's reputation collapsed, crumbling faster than any building touched by fire. And as the people turned from him to me, their applause swelling once more, I understood the truth. Justice doesn't always roar, it can arrive in the steady rise of music, in the dignity of standing tall, in the simple act of refusing to bow. Daniel's reputation collapses, people turn away. The hall no longer echoed with Daniel's voice, but with the quiet strength of truth restored. Michael's scars had been turned into symbols of dignity, while the lies that once seemed unshakable crumbled in front of family and neighbors alike. Justice, though delayed, arrived with the weight of inevitability, reminding all that when courage meets betrayal, truth cannot be silenced. Like the closing chord of a long-forgotten anthem, fairness may come late, but once struck, it resonates forever. No wall of deceit can stand forever against the tide of truth. Like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you felt the justice, or 2 if you think it could have ended differently.